Hi, thank you, Marina.
It's great having you here today.
Nice to be here.
Awesome. So I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to say it's kind of humbling to look at my screen and see that there are more than 500 of you in this conversation with me right now, although the conversation is going to be a little one-sided, I'm afraid. I apologize for that. But let's just get straight to it. I've got a lot of content here, and I hope to give you real value for your hour. I know that we live in a very busy world. Fundraisers are as busy as anyone in the world. And the fact that you've allocated some time to sit with me and spend this time together really makes me feel very appreciative. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I think I just want to give you a little bit of a sense. I was taught years ago, whenever you get up to talk to a group of people, tell them who you are and tell them why you're there. Why I'm here is to help you be a better storyteller, because I firmly believe that storytelling is the most persuasive form of communication that we human beings have, and that if you can tell really great stories, you're far more likely to be a really great fundraiser. Some people are born with a lot of musical talent. Some people are born with a lot of athletic talent. I think I was born with a fairly high degree of talking and storytelling talent. My dad tells me that when we were little, another family would come over to visit, and there'd be a whole bunch of kids running around playing whatever, and 2-year-old Fraser would be in the living room with the adults, talking to them and telling them stories, and them all marveling at how I could form sentences and use big words. I've always been fascinated by stories. I've always been an avid reader. I love movies. I love stories in any format that they come in. And when my first career was in politics, I was a campaign manager and a national director of one of Canada's political parties, the one on the left. And I was a big believer intuitively in using stories to talk about issues. So rather than talking about, Canada's farmland disappearing at a rate of, 5,000 hectares per year, using a story of somebody's farm shrinking by the size of a football field, every month or something like that, and creating the story of that one person who had that field and so on, and making the story a little more real. When I came over to philanthropy 23 years ago, storytelling again was a natural to me, and it was something I just employed. And being originally in the direct response business and doing a lot of direct mail copy and later digital copy and web content and so on, storytelling has always been a natural fit. And I recall several years ago now, when MRI machines began to be used to show how the brain actually works, I remember my then business partner, Leah Eustace, and I both became kind of neurology geeks. And we both independently twigged on very quickly to the fact that storytelling was proven to be a very effective, if not the most effective, form of human communication. So that's why I want to share some of my knowledge with storytelling about you right now. Before we get into the content, I want to invite you to engage with me a little bit. I'm going to walk you through 8 steps or 8 components that make up a great story. So as you'll see graphically, if there is a pie called the story, there are 8 pieces that make up the pie. And I invite you to think about these pieces as we go through. Think about the organization that you're most closely affiliated with, or maybe you work for, and send me, if you want to, send me your outline of a story based on these 8 components. Each component, you need only take maybe a sentence or a paragraph at the most. Your whole submission shouldn't be more than a page. But I am going to award some books, either some books I'm going to show you throughout the course of this presentation, or you could choose one of the books that we've written here at GoodWorks, either Iceberg Philanthropy, 3D Philanthropy, or our latest book, You Can't Take It With You, The Art and Science of Legacy Giving. I'll give you 2 weeks to do that, and if you want to send me your one-pager, I'd love to have a look at it, and of the submissions that come in within the 2-week time period, I'll pick the 5 that I think are best, and I will award books to those 5 people. So let's get into it. I'm going to start by asking you a question. How many stories have you told already today? And how many stories have you listened to already today? I had coffee with a colleague and a friend of mine earlier this morning. She works for Hospital Foundation. I've known her for about 20 years. And we spent an hour in a coffee shop touching base, connecting. We meet about twice a year and like to keep in touch with each other and so on. And I was mentioning this webinar to her, and at the end of the hour, we were talking about the webinar, and I said, you know, Kim, just think of it. Think of this last hour. How many stories have we told each other? And we easily agreed it was well over a dozen. So if you think about how many stories you tell in a day, how many stories you hear in a day or read, I was at AFP Congress this week, and during a day at Congress, I would talk to dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And every one of those conversations, I'm sure, involved one of us telling at least one story. It's just part of how we communicate. It's part of how we connect. It's part of our human experience. When you think of your spouse or your kid coming home after you being apart from that person, that loved one all day, and you say, "Hi, honey, how was your day?" You're inviting a story. You're not asking for a monosyllabic grunt. If you've ever had a teenager, that answer to "how was your day" is often "good," and that's all you get. We're hungry for stories, and we stay connected, and we keep our relationships close, in large part by sharing our stories with each other. We human beings have evolved for some 4 million years, according to the anthropologists, and we've had spoken language for about 2 million years. And you know what? For as long as we've been talking, we've been telling stories. Stories have played a really critical role in our survival, in our using stories to teach, to warn of dangers and so on. Stories are just wired right into us. If you think of us as computers who have software, storytelling is indeed part of our human software. I'd like to share 2 quotes with you. Roger Schenck is a name you may or may not know, but he is in fact considered the pioneer of artificial intelligence. And Robert Schenck says, and he understands the human brain about as well as anybody, we're not ideally set up to understand logic. We are ideally set up to understand stories. In other words, we're hardwired for storytelling. And Ursula Le Guin, and I love this quote and this way of thinking about it, the story is the basic tool of the human mind for the purpose of understanding. There have been great societies that did not use the wheel, but there have been no societies that did not tell stories. And I believe that's absolutely true. So in a historical context, as long as we humans have been living together in tribes and villages and communities, in families, for as long as we've been human, we've been communicating with each other, and for as long as we've communicated with each other, storytelling has been at the core. So storytelling is nothing new, far from it. I wanted to also share with you my 2 favorite books about storytelling. The first one I read many years ago by Annette Simmons. It's called The Story Factor. It's interesting, it's engaging, it's not boring, it's not a textbook. I highly encourage you to pick it up, take a look at it, check and see if your local chapters has it, or if you can get it on Amazon, or if somebody you know has it. The other is a more recent book called Winning the Story Wars by Jonah Sachs. And he interprets storytelling both in that historical anthropological sense, but he also talks about storytelling in the digital era and how we've come past, now that we're past the broadcast era of basically radio and television, and now that we're in the 2.0 world of conversations and exchanges back and forth and engagement, how storytelling is enjoying a renaissance. These 2 books are among the list, along with the 3 I mentioned earlier that we've done here at GoodWorks, and another one I'll show you later. If you submit your story outline, and if you've got one of the 5 best, I'd be happy to let you pick the book that you like, and I'll send it to you. I also want to, on the topic of resources, that book I just mentioned, Winning the Story Wars, there's a great, I think it's a 4.5-minute video on YouTube. And if you go to YouTube and just search Winning the Story Wars, The Hero's Journey, you'll see this one. It starts with that image. And it's a little over 4 minutes long, and it's a really good encapsulation of Jonah Sachs' take on the story. And I really encourage you strongly to find an additional 4 minutes out of your day or out of your week and have a look at that video on YouTube. Also, if you go to YouTube and look up TED Talks. Jonah Sachs did a TED Talk at Rainier, Washington, is it? In the Pacific Northwest. The date was January 21, 2013. So that's Jonah Sachs, S-A-C-H-S. It was a TED Talk, and the date of the TED Talk was January 21, 2013. And I encourage you to take a look at that as well. I have always, as well as loved talking, I've also always loved to sing. And I particularly love to sing songs that mean something to me, that bring up an emotion or a feeling or even a spiritual experience of some sort. And I was reading Bruce Springsteen's autobiography a few years ago, and he used a phrase that the minute I saw that phrase, I thought, yeah, that's exactly it. That's why I play guitar. That's why I have 5 guitars at home. I'm not a great musician, but I love to accompany myself while I sing, because it's really the singing and the expression of the singing that does something quite profound for me. And Bruce Springsteen talks about he only likes to perform songs that he can inhabit. In other words, he feels that he moves into a song as if he was moving into a house, and he's making the song his own. And he also talks about, when he talks about songs and song lyrics, he almost always refers to the character. And when I'm that character, it's like he's an actor in a play. When he's singing a song, he's conveying a story from a particular person's perspective, and that particular person is not him, although it may contain elements of his kind of autobiographical experience. So I just love that idea. And what I would encourage you to do is to inhabit your stories. When you're telling a story on behalf of your charity or your NGO or your cause, whatever it might be, try to make that story yours. Try to crawl right inside it and live inside it and feel it, and really come at it with authenticity and emotion and earnestness. Etta James, if any of you ever get the chance to see a movie called Cadillac Ranch, Beyonce plays the character of Etta James, who was a singer back in the 60s. And there's a song in that movie called "I'd Rather Go Blind." And if you go to YouTube and look up Beyonce or Etta James and look for the song "I'd Rather Go Blind," it's such pain, it's such sadness in that song. It's so visceral, it's unbelievable. And yet, on the other hand, when my daughter, who is now an adult, when she was young, she loved to listen to a song called "Baby Beluga" by Raffi. I hope some of you at least know who Raffi is. And now my daughter has a daughter of her own, and Rory's daughter, Audrey, who is 2 years old now, also loves Baby Beluga. And when I go out to visit them in Vancouver, I rent a guitar, I bring it over to their house, and I play Baby Beluga along with some other tunes for Audrey, and she really enjoys it. The slide I'm showing you now is one that shows, from a neurological perspective, what your audience's brain does, depending on what kind of information you're putting in front of them. So if you're putting together an annual report or a donor newsletter, and you're making it very factual, and you're filling it up with tables and graphs and charts and so on, the image on your left shows you that you're only engaging a couple of areas of your audience's brain, whereas the image on the right, when you're telling a story, they're processing language, they're mimicking movement. There's language comprehension. There's perceiving sense and sounds and sight. There are colors and shapes involved. There are also a whole raft of emotional things, and I'll get to that shortly. Stories just fire up your audience's brain in a way that graphs and charts and facts and figures just can't. So I know that maybe your executive director or your head of programming or your research director or your finance director might like sticking to facts. Well, that's their comfort zone, but if you want to reach your audience's comfort zone and you want to engage them, tell them stories. So with that as the way of preamble, let's then move into what I consider to be the 8 essential elements, or the perfect story in 8 steps. The first step is that your story absolutely has to have a protagonist. Now, the word protagonist comes from the Greek, meaning first in importance. So there are usually more than one character in a story. However, your protagonist is the lead character or the main character. People sometimes confuse the word protagonist with the word hero, and they are not necessarily one and the same thing. You could tell, if you were a hospital foundation, for example, you could tell the story of someone with cancer who has surgery that eradicates the cancer and gives that person a new lease on life. In that story construct, the hero would be the surgeon, whereas the protagonist would be the patient. So that's a bit of a maybe fine-tuning point, but I thought it was important to mention it. There's also something important to know, and again, this compares back to data and facts and figures. Alan Slovic at I believe it's University of Washington, talks about psychic numbing, and he talks about the power of one. If we were talking about refugees, and I started telling you about a refugee camp in Darfur that had 550,000 occupants, it was only designed for 180,000 people. It only has proper sanitation facilities for 3,500 people. There's only enough daily water supply for 34,000 people, and so on and so forth. It's very easy to kind of lose track. I also remember being very mindful of, we at GoodWorks, we were working with UNHCR at the time, and UNHCR was campaigning vigorously on the refugee crisis that was going on because of the conflict in Syria. And we were doing refugee work, direct mail campaigns, digital campaigns, and so on behalf of UNHCR. And I remember looking at this stuff and thinking, why don't I care more? I mean, I know there are humans suffering, but why does this not get me where I really live, like in my heart, in my gut? And then, like so many other people, one day we in the West were all exposed to this image of this little boy, Alan Kurdi. I believe he was 4 years old or 3 years old, washed up on a beach on the Mediterranean shoreline. And that one image captured the world's imagination, and that's when the world sat up and started paying attention to the crisis in Syria. I know in my case, shortly after this, I was invited to do some pro bono work with a graduate class in communications at Ottawa U to help them market and raise funds for a nonprofit based out of the University of Ottawa that was helping private sponsors secure refugees and get through the work and so on, providing legal advice. And I did that gladly. It felt so good to be able to have a chance to, in my heart, feel like I was helping to prevent another little boy from washing up on a beach and everyone's heart being broken in the process. When you've chosen your story, so perhaps it's a child at a children's hospital who has a serious life-threatening illness, you've decided that you want to tell that child's story, but who should be the protagonist in that story? You probably have several choices. You could tell the story from the child's point of view. You could tell it from the child's siblings' point of view. You could tell it from a parent's point of view. You could tell it from the doctor's point of view. You could tell it from a nurse's point of view. And you need to think about who is the protagonist that is going to best articulate this story. And your choice of the protagonist should be driven very much by who you have determined your audience to be. I am a huge believer that in modern communication, your choice of audience is the most important thing you can do, and you need to be very clear on your audience. So if this were a children's hospital story and I was writing a direct mail piece, I might in fact choose the child's grandparents, not the child's parents, like a grandfather rather than a father, to tell the story, because direct mail donors tend to be older, and it's more likely that grandparents of young children are going to get this direct mail rather than parents of this young children. So I'm going to get people in their 60s and 70s rather than people in their, say, 30s or early 40s. So think about who your protagonist is going to be. If we think of some very popular and common stories, I hope you're familiar with one or two of these. So in the story A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, of course, our protagonist is Ebenezer Scrooge. In Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, it's Frodo Baggins. In The Wizard of Oz, it's Dorothy from Kansas. I don't think she had a last name. And if you think about your favorite story, it probably won't take you long to determine who your protagonist is. So after the protagonist, for me, when I'm putting a story together, the second factor I want to look at is who are my cast of characters? There are all sorts of, and in all kinds of storytelling, there are all types of characters that play a role in stories. There's a sidekick, Robin to Batman. There's the mentor, Gandalf to Frodo. There's the love interest. There's often a chorus if you think of Greek dramas. There's sometimes a group of people or a West Side Story. There's often a villain. There's often a victim and a rescuer. There's often some kind of expert or a wizard or someone who has an ability or a knowledge beyond everyone else who is able to turn some kind of key to open up a new possibility. There's often a child. There's often family. And the importance of your cast of characters when you're putting your story together is that your characters in your story give your protagonist the opportunity to show himself or herself at a deeper level. We human beings are the most social animals on the planet, and our relationships are the most important thing we have, whether we realize it or not. I know that at my advanced stage of life, I have determined that my daughter, my granddaughter, my wife, and my 2 stepdaughters are the 5 people in this world that I would step in front of a bus for. And I always refocus myself every day to remind myself that it's those 5 relationships that make my life worth living. And so it's that your cast of characters give your protagonist the opportunity to sort of blossom and show his or her real humanity. And they're absolutely important in making your story matter. There's the odd story, I think of The Old Man and the Sea, where it's basically one guy in a boat and a whale he's trying to catch. Those kinds of stories are quite unusual. There are usually a cast. And of course, in the stories I mentioned earlier, in A Christmas Carol, you've got the ghost of Jacob Marley. You've got the 3 spirits, the ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas yet to come. You've got Bob Cratchit, you've got Tiny Tim, you've got Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig, and the same Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship, the Dwarves, the Men, the Elves, who all go along with Frodo on his mission. The Wizard of Oz, the Lion, the Tin Man, and so on. The witches, the wizard himself, the Munchkins, who make up the cast. And your favorite story, if you think of it, you could easily make a list of who is in that cast. So I would encourage you, before you start telling your story or writing your story, to just think a little bit about who are the cast members in this story and how do I feature them to their greatest benefit. The next step, the third step in constructing the story, is the journey. I call it the journey. Some people call it the quest. I would put it to you that, in my opinion, every story goes from here to there, either physically or metaphorically. Every story has an element of movement, of search. Many literary academics call it the quest. The hero's quest, again, is an often used phrase. There's a guy named Joseph Campbell, who, again, you can find on YouTube. He's written a bunch of books about mythology, about classic storytelling. And the form of storytelling that we use today is pretty much identical to what Homer used when he told the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Jason's travels and so on, back in ancient Greece. The fundamental structure of the story has not changed all that much. I remember when I was a young boy, say 8, 10, 12 years old, I was just addicted to a series of novels, boys' novels, about a character, a protagonist named Bronk Burnett. And Bronk Burnett was this athlete, and it followed his adventures in high school and university as an athlete on the football team, on the baseball team, on the basketball team. And it was always the quest for, like, the state championship or to win the national tournament. And it was real jock stuff. It was real jock candy. And I ate this stuff up. I went to my library every week and took out another book. And thankfully for me, there were a whole pile of them. But again, every story involves some kind of journey or some kind of search. So I would encourage you to think about, again, before you write your story or before you tell your story, think about what is the actual journey involved here. And just about any philanthropic story has that quest or that journey in it. It could be an abandoned puppy seeking a forever home. Speaking of puppies, I remember the most famous and most popular Super Bowl commercial of all time was a commercial that Budweiser beer created. And it was nothing about beer. It was about a little golden retriever puppy that got lost. And the Budweiser horses, that team of Clydesdales that pulls the big Budweiser wagon, they helped to find him. And it was a story of a lost puppy who finds his way back to his family thanks to these Budweiser horses. It had nothing to do with beer, and yet people loved it. Your story could be a person with cancer seeking healing. It could be a family who are the victims of domestic violence looking for safety and a new life. It could be a refugee seeking a safe home for her family. It could be a research scientist seeking a cure for some disease or ailment. There's always some kind of search or some kind of journey, and I would encourage you to be very deliberate about that component of your story. Again, if we look at our list of 3 common ones in A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge's journey is actually from life to death and back to life, changed. The moment of death is when he looks at his gravestone in the future and imagines himself dying lonely and alone. Lord of the Rings was the necessary journey that this unlikely hero, Frodo Baggins, had to make to Mount Doom in order to save the world from evil. And in The Wizard of Oz, once Dorothy finds herself in Oz, the whole story is about her search to return home and the safety of home and the comfort of home. Little Red Riding Hood, of course, the journey was from her house to Granny's house, grandmother's house, and this wolf character was sort of in the way. So let's go to number 4. I hope we're doing okay so far. We're already halfway through our time. I can't believe it. Number 4 is the nemesis. Nemesis was the Greek goddess of divine retribution for those who got sort of too big for their britches. So in Greek mythology, if someone got too full of themselves, too conceited, too big for their britches, Nemesis found a way, the goddess Nemesis found a way to knock that person down. In modern literary terms, the Nemesis is the force that acts against the interest of the protagonist. So where would Batman be without the Joker or the Riddler or many other villains that come up in Batman stories? The main role of the nemesis is to work in opposition to the protagonist's search. So you've got a protagonist trying to go from A to B, and you've got the nemesis coming in and trying to push either end the life or the existence of the protagonist, or to push them off course and prevent them from reaching the goal. And the story's tension is always, I'm going to say always, created by the struggle between the protagonist and the nemesis. Now, when we think about the nemesis, we usually think of the villain, and in many stories, the nemesis is the villain. Even in the Bible, God had Satan as his nemesis. Although, in our case, when we're telling philanthropic stories, we usually don't have a villain per se that we can personify. The nemesis might be breast cancer. The nemesis might be poverty. The nemesis might be domestic violence. The nemesis might be neglect of domestic animals. But it's really important, if you're going to construct and tell a powerful story, that there be a strong and powerful nemesis that creates a credible and believable threat to the protagonist's goal of completing his journey. I hope that makes sense. I'm really not trying to get too academic, but it's the tension that the nemesis creates with the protagonist that really helps to create the oomph of the story, and really helps to get your audience kind of fired up and wound up and feeling that tension as well. So again, the 3 stories I had chosen in the Christmas Carol, the nemesis is actually a lonely death. In Lord of the Rings, it's the wizard Sauron. In The Wizard of Oz, it's the Wicked Witch of the West, and even to some degree the wizard himself, for creating this false kind of image of a land. And in your favorite story, there's a nemesis for sure. So I'd like to just take 1 second, if you need to kind of stretch or fill up your glass of water, take just a few seconds here. We're not going to stop for long. Marina, I don't know if you have a question or two you wanted to throw at me at this point, or if you'd like me to keep going. I'm in your hands.
Sure. Well, you can decide, Fraser, if you'd like to take this question now or field it after.
I think we're doing okay for time, so why don't we take one or two?
Okay, perfect. So we had someone asking if you could explain a little bit more about what the difference between the nemesis and the villain is and how to identify
Okay,
that.
the difference is the villain would fall. The villain is a type of nemesis, just like a golden retriever is a kind of dog. But the villain isn't always the nemesis. You don't have to be a villain to be a nemesis. So, as I said, if you're the Canadian Cancer Society, your nemesis is the disease, cancer. It's not a person. If you're an animal welfare or an oceans charity, your nemesis could be the neglect of people who aren't careful with their plastics and where their plastics end up. So the nemesis in traditional storytelling, in traditional literature, there is usually some kind of villain, and that villain is usually deliberate in doing something bad. They're painted as an evil person. In our storytelling, and in the storytelling I think our fellow webinar attendees today are going to be doing, your nemesis probably isn't all that often a kind of a bad person, an evil person. It might be ignorance, people who don't know better. It might be people who aren't aware of the issue. It might be people who don't fully appreciate the effects of their behavior. It could also be, as I said, it could be a disease. It could be any number of things. So I hope that helps. And if whoever asked the question would like to talk to me more about it, please feel free to, you can see my email and my number right on top of the screen. Feel free to get in touch and I'd be happy to talk with you.
That's great, Fraser. Are you up for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think this will be useful to several people on the call. Katie is asking, for environmental work, I'm struggling with who the protagonist or characters would be when we are usually working with wildlife, lands, water, etc., i.e. non-humans.
That's a great question. We one time wrote a letter, a fundraising letter on behalf of a domestic violence shelter. And the signatory of the letter was the dining room table at the shelter, because in this particular case, the issue was privacy and protecting the identity of the people who were, being helped, being supported in their quest to get away from a violent household. So we gave the dining room table a personality, and as these women and their children gathered around and made meals and shared meals at the dining room table, the table talked about what he heard. Our table was a guy, and we gave him a male voice, and we used that way. We have done a letter from a kidney that was involved in a transplant, and the kidney told the story. Your environmental letter or your story could be from a tree, it could be from an animal, it could be from someone who cares, it could be from a donor who supports the cause, it could be from one of your program people, it could be from someone who lives in or near an area that you have program interest in. I would encourage, and the other thing, it's beyond the scope of this session, but I'll mention briefly, when you start to develop a storytelling culture at your organization, then it's not just the question of the one story, but how can we create, if you like, a quilt of stories that tell our whole story. So we did a legacy campaign once for a university in Western Canada, and we told in a series of letters a story from the former chancellor of the university, who had come as a very small town farm girl in the 1950s and had become an administrative worker at the university, went back, got higher degrees, became the chancellor, and now that she's retired, she's an active fundraiser and donor. We told the story of a researcher who was working on searching for a virus that could basically eat cancer cells. And that was where funding was going, was to support his research. We told the story of a young woman who was on academic scholarship, and the scholarships allowed her not to have to work part-time, but to focus on her education. And she was, with that, able to get into medical school or veterinary school, and she wanted to use that veterinary degree to implement new ways of delivering very community-based more complicated veterinary services and so on. We told a story of a married couple who had gone to this university together, fallen in love. They became teachers. They taught all over the world. They came back to this Western province when they retired and are now active donors. They founded a music festival in the city the university's in, and they became legacy donors. So when you look at that kind of matrix of stories all kind of woven together, you start, the institution starts to come to life. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. I could do a whole session on that topic, but it was a great question. And again, if you'd like to get in touch with me individually, I'd be happy to talk more about it.
That's great, Fraser. Thank you so much.
So let's plow ahead. So the next element, and it's critically important to me, there are three of these eight that are really critical, and this is one of them. I think the protagonist is one, and this one is the second, and the third one will come shortly. But really being deliberate and really being thoughtful about how you can activate the senses and the emotions in your audience, whether it's a one-on-one conversation on a couch where you're telling a story to a major gift donor, whether it's a direct mail appeal, whether it's something in your newsletter, something on your website, or in whatever format you're telling your story. I would really encourage you to try to trigger emotional and sensory reactions. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of something Paul MacLean identified, and it's called the triune brain. And again, I've done whole sessions that start with this. But essentially, when we were, if you go way back in evolutionary times, we lived in the ocean. We were fish, and we kind of turned into reptiles, and we crawled up on the beach. When we were back at that stage, we just had that little red brain at the bottom of the image. And that's our, often called the snake brain. And that's our instinctive brain or our survival brain. And that is the brain that basically just tries to keep us alive. So our most fundamental instincts, and they remain our most fundamental instincts today, are to survive as an individual and to survive as a species. So this most powerful part of our brain governs our desire to survive and to reproduce, which is, well, I won't go there. Anyway, the second level of the brain, the blue brain that you're looking at, evolved once we became mammals and once we started having live young, nursing them, once we started to grow hair, and ultimately as we got up on 2 feet and became primates and so on our way to becoming humans. The second brain, the mammalian brain, the limbic system, or the amygdala, it has a bunch of different names, is really the emotional brain. And the emotional brain is more powerful than the thinking brain. And you know, whenever you get mad at your kid or mad at your partner, or you just kind of lose it, that's your emotional brain taking over. And you know in your thinking brain that you shouldn't be doing that it's probably not helpful, but you can't help it. You just kind of go off on that emotional thrust because your limbic brain has activated so strongly that it just has commandeered the ship called your life and your behavior. And then finally, as we became human, we developed that big brain on top, which in this image is sort of pinky brown and the 2 shades of green. That's our neocortex. And that is, in effect, the laptop computer we all have inside our skulls. That's where we think, that's where we calculate, that's where we are able to do abstract thought, where we're able to connect things, where we're able to see patterns. It's really our thinking brain. The key point here is that our thinking brain is what we like to think governs our lives, and the thinking brain is what your annual report with all its charts and graphs and numbers tries to talk to. Having said that, when the emotional brain is activated, it takes over from the thinking brain. It's more powerful. And when the snake brain, the survival brain, kicks in or fires up, it's more powerful than the other two. So I like to encourage people to try to go deeper in the audience's brain than just talking about facts and figures. And last year, you know, we served 350,000 meals to homeless people. Well, that's great, but you can do better than that, and you can have more impact on that. Again, this is a whole seminar, but I'll just touch on it. If you think of you know, red, yellow, and blue as being the primary color palette, there were primary emotions, and as we evolved, we developed 4 of them. And they were all emotions that were kind of programmed into us in order to help reinforce behaviors that help us survive. So if we eat a good meal and we get a good night's sleep and we're happy, eating a good meal and having a good night's sleep make us strong and make us ready to survive another day and secure the food and whatever we need to do that day. If we have lost something that's important to our survival, we feel sadness, and we don't like the feeling of sadness. Sadness always involves loss. And so sadness has been programmed into us because if we've lost something that was important to our survival, we want to have that feeling and then avoid that feeling in the future by avoiding the behavior that's not good for our survival. Fear is the flip side. Fear is if we face a threat and a threat that is stronger than us. You've heard of fight or flight. Well, this is the flight. We have a fear response that makes us run from that threat so that the tiger doesn't eat us or the fire doesn't burn us or whatever it might be. And finally, fight or flight, this is the fight. If someone threatens to, if we were cave people and we were living in prehistoric times and someone from down the way came along and wanted to steal your piece of meat from the campfire, you might get up and make threatening gestures or even hit them over the head a bit with your stick. When you're angry, you're defending something that you believe is yours and something that is important for your survival. So our emotions have been programmed into us over millions of years in order to help us feel those emotions and amend our behavior or continue our behavior in the case of happiness so that we will increase our chances of survival. Darwin was right, survival of the fittest. We are very much evolutionary characters. By the same token, senses really help illuminate your story and breathe life into your story. I have often, when I speak at conferences, told the story of the night my daughter was born as one of the two most important moments in my life. And my story kind of concludes with baby Rory, being all of 5 minutes old, in my arms and just looking deep into my eyes. And I know that newborn babies can't actually see that well, but she was gazing at me, and I swear that she was looking at me with this look that says, "There you are, I've been waiting for you." It was a profound moment, and it was the look in her eyes, it was the sight that brought that moment to life. I remember we did a story once from a heart surgeon, really well known here in Ottawa, named Wilbert Keon, and we were asking him about what does it feel like to hold a beating human heart in your hands. And he talked about how it's slippery and it's about the size of a grapefruit and it beats very vigorously even when it's sick and it's being operated on. And he went on to talk about how he feels so humbled that he's been given this godlike power through his medical training to be able to, take someone who's dying and give them new life. And yet he feels very humble and he's just another human being. It was really profound, but it started with the touch of, it was my business partner, Josie Van Herp, who asked him, what does it feel like to hold a human heart in your hands? And it was starting with that tactile feeling of holding a heart that led to this very powerful part of the story. Your taste can be activated. I don't know if you remember, if you had childhood experiences in your grandmother's kitchen, the taste of her lemonade, things like that can be so powerful. The sense of smell. My friend and colleague, Meg Friedman, used to work at a long-term care facility, a largely Jewish long-term care facility called Hillel Lodge. And she would take major donors on a tour just before lunchtime because the kitchen was cooking lunch, and donors would say, "Oh, it smells just like my granny's house on the Sabbath." And so if you're writing a story, think very deliberately, or if you're telling a story, think very deliberately about senses, taste, touch, smell, sound, and think about feelings, anger, sadness, fear, and happiness, and try to activate the senses and activate the feelings, because it's senses and emotions that will really bring your story to life. The third of the really important trio, in my opinion, so protagonist being the first one, emotions and senses being the second, and the magic moment to me is the third. Now, the first thing I want to say is not every story has or can has a magic moment, and that's okay. But if in your story you can create a magic moment, you're probably going to take your story from a good story to a great story. If any of you studied a drama or theater or even creative writing at, say, at university or even in high school, you may have been exposed to this. It's the classic structure of many modern stories. And when I say modern, I'm going back to the Greeks and I'm going back to Shakespeare. And if you look at in Act 3, that highest point on that line, it's called the climax of Act 3. That's usually where your magic moment occurs. It's of a long story that may take, I don't know, 10 pages to tell, or may take you 20 minutes to tell. It's that moment that just absolutely grips your listeners or your readers' attention, and they're 100% submerged in your story. I don't know if any of you are old enough, as I am, to recall a movie called Sophie's Choice that came out in the 1980s. This was about the time that I got married, and we were just planning on starting our family, and Rory came along not too long after that. And in this movie, Meryl Streep plays a Polish woman who is, I believe, part Jewish. And later in the story, she's on a railway platform in Poland with her little boy and her little girl. They're both about 5 or 6 years old. And a Gestapo officer stops the Meryl Streep character on the train platform, asks her where she's going, wants to see her papers, and she didn't have her papers on her. He suspected she's Jewish. She denies it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the platform, they are loading a car to go to a concentration camp, and there are Jews with the Star of David, little badges on their jackets, and they're trudging along the platform and being sent to their death. And this Nazi officer is staring her down, and she doesn't have her papers. Then he says, "Well, then you must be Jewish," and she says, "No, I'm not." And then he gives her the choice. This is what Sophie's Choice turns into. All right, well, that train is heading for Auschwitz, and one of your children has to be on that train. You pick right now, which one are you going to send? And of course she reacted, "I can't do that. I can't give up one of my children," what have you. And he just keeps pressing. And finally he says to her, and he means it, "You either pick a child now, or I'm going to send them both." And without hesitation, she thrusts out her girl's hand to his and says, "Take my daughter." The reason I'm sharing this with you is this is a 2-hour movie where the whole movie is orchestrated and designed, and the architecture of the entire movie is to create this, and I've timed it, 94-second scene on the railway platform where she is approached by an army officer and ends up having to sacrifice her daughter in order to save her son. That's what I mean by the magic moment. So when you're thinking about or sitting down to write your story or imagining your story, or you're going to make a video, whatever it might be, ask yourself, is there a magic moment in the story? And can I be very intentional about making that magic moment really come to life? I mean, to go back to the three stories I talked about earlier, we've got Ebenezer Scrooge waking up joyfully on Christmas morning, realizing he's not dead, that he has life still, and he's going to be joyful from now on. Dorothy clicks her heels, says there's no place like home 3 times, and she wakes up back in Kansas. And Frodo, after he drops the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, gets to return to the quiet and the peace of the Shire amidst his hobbit friends. Those are the magic moments. There's one moment I recall from many years ago. My colleagues and I were working with the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation, and this was back in the time when most of us used landlines. And the story we told, it was in a direct mail letter, was a story told by one woman, and she was one of 4 sisters. And she talked about growing up in a house full of 4 girls and how they were best friends and rivals, and how sometimes they competed for boys, and how they, after high school, went to different universities and ended up living in different cities. But every Sunday afternoon, these sisters would call each other one-on-one. This is before, group chats and FaceTime and so on. And so, Darlene would call Lucy, and Lucy would call Susan, and Susan would call Deborah, and Deborah would call Darlene, and Darlene would call Lucy, and so on. And they'd have this series of one-on-one conversations every Sunday because they were close and it was important to them to stay connected. And then one of the sisters was diagnosed with breast cancer, and by the time she was diagnosed, she was told it was pretty advanced and that it would likely be the end of her. And she was determined to see her 2 boys finish high school. And so she bravely underwent the treatment. the radiation and the chemotherapy. She survived long enough to see her two boys graduate, and then she got cancer again and she died. And the sister who told the story, one of the surviving sisters, at the end of the letter, she said something to the effect of, you know, Darlene's been gone for a year and a half, but on Sunday afternoons, I still find myself reaching for the phone only to remember that she's not there. And I actually wrote that story, and a year later, we had some direct mail samples sitting on our boardroom table, and I picked this envelope up and I started reading it, and I forgot I had written it. And I started to cry, and one of my partners came in and said, Fraser, what's wrong? And I said, I'm reading this story about me. And they just started laughing and said, you idiot, you wrote that a year ago. But there was the magic moment of reaching for the phone. And so if you have the chance to create a magic moment, I encourage you to do so. Finally, next to last, we've got resolution. And resolution is when your story kind of gets wrapped up. It's like tying the bow on the Christmas present, if you like. Think of Disney movies, think of most stories you heard as a child. It's sort of they lived happily ever after is the most common resolution. Scrooge finds his second shot at life. Frodo returns home to the Shire. Dorothy wakes up in Kansas. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Rocky. He survives the fight. He calls out for Adrian, the woman he loves. The three little pigs get their stone house. If you try telling your child or your grandchild or any child a story, and a story that doesn't resolve, just see what their reaction is. Well, what happened then? How did it end? People hunger for a resolution to their stories. The interesting thing about our storytelling is that usually we have a story that remains unresolved. And this is an important distinction I hope you'll pay attention to. In our work, the story is often left unresolved, and the donor is invited, or the prospect is invited to resolve it, which means what your job as the storyteller is to paint a picture of what the resolution could look like, and then convince the donor that her gift will help bring that resolution about. And as we've said before, you know, it could be a puppy finding a forever home. It could be a cancer-free mom coming home to her kids. It could be the student who got the bursary, graduating and going on to grad school. It could be the world becoming AIDS-free, HIV/AIDS-free because of research that the donor funds. If you convince your donor that she can resolve the story that you're telling, the money will be yours. I can't guarantee it, but it's pretty close. And then finally, number 9, which is related to the unresolved story, is the desire to act. Most stories, you know, movies, novels, what have you, leave us with a feeling or even a spiritual state. I just saw the Mr. Rogers movie, and to me, there was spiritual elements in that. I encourage you to go see it. It could be the feeling of discovering a new love, the joy of a victory, a hard-fought victory, the relief of returning home, you know, returning to safety from a place of danger. And I think as fundraisers, we need to go the extra step. We need to do more than just create feelings. We need to create a desire to engage and to take some sort of action. And as I like to say when I'm talking to my colleagues in staff meetings or looking at their work or helping them, whatever, collaborating, I say, have we created the itch? You know, have we created the itch that needs a scratch? Because once you've got the itch, you do want to scratch. A book that I really like on the subject of influence and that will help you with this is called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. This is one of the books that you can have if you submit an outline to me and you choose it. It's really great, and if you don't get it from me, I encourage you to go look for it and find it. I won't get into it now because I realize we're running short of time. But I have one more thing I want to touch on, and that is when you put these 8 elements of a great story together, what you create is what I believe is the goal of any kind of storytelling, and that is what's called the suspension of disbelief. So if you stop for a minute and think of movies that you've gone to see, have you ever sat in a movie theater watching a movie and you look at your watch? If you look at your watch while you're watching a movie, you're still in your seat, you're still an audience member watching a movie, you're still detached from the story. You're still at arm's length from the story. On the other hand, if you start to cry, as I did at the Mr. Rogers movie about 5 or 6 different times, you've become part of the story, and that story has become your story. And when I circle all the way back to choosing the protagonist, especially if the protagonist's feelings and are those that I'm sharing because I identify so strongly with that protagonist. That's when you know you've really done your job, when you've really, it's like your audience has crossed a bridge and come right inside your story. And like I said about Bruce Springsteen inhabiting a song, your audience inhabits your story. And when you create that kind of storytelling magic, you're going to feel fabulous and you're going to make a lot of money. So to wrap it up, number one, you want to choose a protagonist. Number two, select your cast of characters. Three, sort of map out the journey. Number four, identify your nemesis. Five, find a way that you can draw on your audience's emotions and senses and activate them. Six, if you can, create a magic moment. Seven, probably not come to a resolution, but articulate the resolution and invite your donor or your prospect to create the resolution. And number eight, create the itch that needs to be scratched. And if you do those things well and you're successful in creating the suspension of disbelief, you're going to love storytelling like you never have before, and you're going to raise a pile of money. That's it. Last thing I want to say is we live in a very busy, over-communicated world. We live in what's called an attention economy, where today the most valuable resource out there is not gold or oil or water or Bitcoin. The most valuable resource in today's economy is the attention of the marketplace. And I know that more than 600 of you have given me your attention for the past hour, and I'm humbled and I'm grateful for that. And I want to thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope we can do this again at some point in the not too distant future. Marina, how's that?
Thank you so much, Fraser. That's been fabulous. And I know that we're running up on time here. I think we will, if you're okay with it, Fraser, extend by a few minutes to answer a few questions.
Happy to.
Awesome. But for those of you that do need to jump on the hour, just know that we are recording the full session. So we'll also record the Q&A that's coming up, and you will get that recording later today. So if you do need to leave now, please go ahead and do so and check out that recording later on. So let's just dive right in, Fraser. Here's a really great question. Do you have any thoughts on the line between a compelling story versus being exploitive? For example, telling a story about domestic violence without necessarily turning the person into a victim.
First thing I want to say, and it was in my notes, and I think I neglected to say it, I never, ever, ever want to encourage anyone to use a story to manipulate the truth or manipulate events or manipulate the actuality or the real mission of your organization. Having said that, I do believe that in order for us to tell strong philanthropic stories, we have to present the problem that needs solving. And so in the case of domestic violence, we usually would tell a story without identifying anyone. Having said that, if the person was willing to share her story, it's usually a her, I would want to tell it in pretty graphic detail. Again, I don't want to exaggerate it, but I believe in telling the story in its fullness. And I mean, in the case of domestic violence, I grew up in a violent home. I know what that's like, and I share my story with people quite frequently. So we have this debate a lot with international development NGOs about, they call it, poverty porn, showing the starving child with the fly on its cheek and so on. And I guess my answer is, the way I look at it, if that is what's really happening, then, and if we have the permission of those involved, then let's tell the story as it is. So I don't believe in sugarcoating, but I don't believe in exaggerating. And you absolutely need to respect the characters involved. Like, for example, if someone's sharing a story where there's a villain and the villain has a name and you name that villain without his or her permission, I think you might have an issue. So you need to be sensitive, you need to be thoughtful, but I would encourage you not to let the communications committee or whoever the group of people is in your office who likes to put their grubby fingerprints on the copy, don't let them water it down to the point where it's just pablum and nobody's going to pay attention to it.
And you mentioned permission, Fraser. I think that's a good topic to dig into a little bit. We did have the question come up of what if your protagonist doesn't have permission to include the cast of characters, for instance? How can you still create a compelling story?
I think you can. I think there again. It gets very situational. I think you can talk about the cast of characters without naming them. So, for example, if it was a Me Too movement kind of story, someone could say, "When I was in high school, there was a teacher who did this." Um, that person would have had dozens of teachers through her high school career. So, in my judgment, that would be okay. Rather than saying when I was in grade 12, my history teacher did that, and anybody who was there could identify who it was. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Thank you.
But the main point there, Marina, I think is take the time though to be thoughtful about it, because none of us likes to go after the fact. The story's out there, and you realize you just didn't take the time to think, and you were in a rush, and you did something kind of careless. Take time. Storytelling is a craft. It's an art, and treat it with respect. And if you do that, you'll tell great stories, and you'll be rewarded for it.
No, that's excellent. Now, how does this storytelling process that you've outlined today fit into the overall communication strategy? Or is it one tactic that's part of a larger strategy?
Well, I would say the first question I would ask with, let's say, a new client, a new fundraising client that I was working with, would be, are you willing to make the shift to a storytelling culture? Will we make storytelling our primary means of communicating with our audiences? Would your donor report become primarily stories? Would your annual report become primarily stories? Could your website become primarily stories? I mean, how far are you willing to go? I think you need to kind of talk about your parameters first. But I think storytelling in and of it, I'll give you an example, quite frankly. When we rebranded as GoodWorks in 2011, so almost a decade ago now, we very deliberately, we could have said we're the direct mail experts, or we're the digital experts, or we're the legacy experts. If you go to the GoodWorks website today, the first thing you're going to see are the words, "We are storytellers." We decided to plant our flag on that identity, and when we have staff meetings, we talk about storytelling all the time. Do they have a story inventory? How many storytellers have they lined up? Do they have a story that illustrates this? Is their executive director willing to talk about why he cares so much about the cause? Storytelling can become very central to everything you do if you see its value and if you can persuade the team to go along.
Excellent. And I think that's a great place to leave things, Fraser. I want to finish up with just one last thing. And if you could just review your book giveaway, because we've had quite a few people interested in that. So maybe you could just run through those details again for everybody.
Sure. So if you get a hold of the deck and look at the 8 elements, protagonist, cast of characters, nemesis, the 8 elements. If you just on a single side of a single sheet of paper use those 8 topics, those 8 headers, and just write a sentence or a paragraph at the most about a story that you think you could tell as a part of your charity or NGOs or nonprofits work, then send me that one page and do it within the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today, I will look at those I get. I'll pick the 5 that I think are the best, that look like the most compelling stories, and the outlines have been well put together. And then I will get in touch with you 5 people and say, I talked about 3 books during the course of the presentation. There are also 3 books that I have written or co-written. Which one of those would you like? And you make your choice, and I will send you one of those 6 books.
That's great, Fraser, and we so appreciate you offering that to our audience. That's awesome.
My pleasure.
That's awesome. Well, I want to thank you again, Fraser, for such a great presentation. It's been really wonderful hosting you here at Charity Village, and we were very pleased to finish off our webinars of 2019 with your presentation. So thank you.
You're welcome, and please invite me back sometime.
We'll be sure to do that. I just want to remind everyone before we sign off that we are going to follow up with you by email. Again, that should be later this afternoon with the webinar recording and the slide deck. So as Fraser mentioned, you can check the deck there for all the contact information, etc. There will also be a short survey that will take less than 5 minutes to fill out. So we do hope that you'll complete that for us if you can. You'll have an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in a future session. And we'll also be sure to share all the feedback with Fraser as well. I am sorry to say this was our last free webinar of 2019. I do want to take a moment to give a shout out to all of our presenters this year. They helped us run 24 free webinars, which is the most we've ever done in a year. And of course, we want to send a thank you as well to all of our participants. You so enthusiastically embrace our webinar series, and we're so pleased to be able to bring you these quality learning opportunities. Watch for more announcements soon about webinars to come in 2020. And with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of 2019. Thank you so much.